There was a time when Britain didn't just compete in the global motor industry, it owned it. The Mini, the E-Type, Aston Martin, British engineering was feared by every competitor on Earth. Then the 1970s arrived. Strikes, oil crises, and foreign competition began tearing at the foundations. And yet, millions of ordinary British families were still out there buying cars, filling driveways from Cornwall to Caithness with vehicles that became permanently etched into the national memory. These were the real cars of Rail Britain. In this video, we are counting down the 10 cars that defined British roads in the 1970s, the models that families relied upon, that learner drivers feared, and that now exist as powerful symbols of a very particular era in British life. Some of these cars were genuinely brilliant, others were deeply flawed. All of them, without exception, left a lasting mark on the national memory. Whether you remember sitting in the back seat as a child or gripping the steering wheel for the very first time, this list is for you. And if you enjoy British history, nostalgia, and stories that take you back to another era, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Britain Rewind. It genuinely helps us continue the journey. Now we will work our way through some unforgettable machines before we reach the end of this list. But number 1 stands in a category entirely its own. Let's begin. Number 10. The Hillman Avenger. Launched in 1970 by the Rootes Group, which had recently come under the ownership of Chrysler, the Hillman Avenger arrived with considerable optimism behind it. It was a modern, practical family saloon, well-proportioned, reasonably priced, and designed to compete directly with the Ford Escort in the increasingly competitive family car segment. For a brief moment, it appeared that Chrysler's investment in British manufacturing might produce something genuinely competitive. The Avenger sold respectably in its early years and even enjoyed some success in international rally competition. However, as the decade progressed, build quality inconsistencies and the broader instability of the Chrysler UK operation began to undermine its reputation. When Peugeot acquired the brand in 1978, the Avenger's days were clearly numbered. It faded quietly, leaving behind a modest but affectionate legacy among those who drove one. Number 9. The Triumph Dolomite. The Triumph Dolomite represented one of the more genuinely exciting propositions to emerge from British Leyland in the early part of the decade. Launched in 1972, it offered a level of sporting refinement that few family saloons could match at the price point. The Dolomite Sprint, introduced in 1973, was particularly remarkable, featuring a 16-valve engine at a time when such technology was considered exotic territory. For enthusiasts, it was a revelation. The problem, however, lay not in the engineering ambitions but in the execution. British Leyland's chronic industrial relations problems meant that quality control was erratic, and cars frequently left the factory in a condition that embarrassed the designers who had worked so hard on them. The Dolomite deserved far better than the corporate environment in which it found itself, and history has treated it with the quiet sympathy it merits. Number 8. The Vauxhall Viva. The Vauxhall Viva occupied a curious position in the 1970s British car market. It was everywhere, and yet somehow it never quite achieved the iconic status of its rivals. First introduced in the 1960s, the Viva continued into the new decade in its HC series form, selling steadily to families who value dependability and straightforward value over any particular sense of character. General Motors' Luton operation produced it in enormous numbers, and on that basis alone it deserves its place on this list. The Viva's problems were not dramatic ones. There were no spectacular engineering failures or headline controversies. Instead, it suffered from a certain ordinariness that made it easy to overlook. Rust became its defining enemy as the years passed, and few examples survive today. Its very commonness has, paradoxically, made it a rarity. Number 7. The Austin Allegro. Few cars in British automotive history have attracted more affectionate mockery than the Austin Allegro, launched by British Leyland in 1973. Intended as a modern replacement for the beloved 1100 and 1300 models, it arrived with a distinctive, some might say baffling, quartic steering wheel and a silhouette that struck many observers as ungainly. British Leyland's marketing presented it with considerable confidence, and initial sales were not without promise. But the car's troubled development history, combined with the industrial disputes that plagued its production, meant that early examples suffered from serious quality problems. Stories of rear windows that popped out under pressure became folklore. Motoring journalists of the era were largely unkind, and the nickname Allegro stuck with uncomfortable persistence. And yet, time has been unexpectedly generous to it. Today, the Allegro carries a peculiar cult status that its creators could never have anticipated. Number 6. The Ford Capri. Ford introduced the Capri to Britain in 1969, but it was throughout the 1970s that the car truly embedded itself into the national consciousness. Marketed as the car you always promised yourself, the Capri delivered something that few affordable British cars managed. It made the driver feel genuinely special. Its fastback styling drew obvious inspiration from the American muscle car tradition, yet it remained accessible enough in price to appeal to a wide audience. In offices and factories across the country, the Capri became a symbol of aspiration. Its problems were relatively minor by the standards of the era. It was perhaps more image than performance in its more modest specifications. But as a cultural artifact of 1970s Britain, the Capri stands almost without parallel. It understood its audience completely, and its audience, in return, loved it completely. Number 5. The Rover P6. The Rover P6 was, in many respects, the most sophisticated British car available to the executive buyer during the early and middle part of the decade. Originally launched in 1963, it continued in production until 1977, and throughout that period it maintained a reputation for technical innovation and genuine quality that placed it well above many of its domestic competitors. Its construction featured a base unit structure that was genuinely advanced for its time, and the 3500 V8 variant offered performance that could embarrass far more expensive machinery. Among professional classes, doctors, solicitors, senior managers, the Rover P6 carried considerable social weight. Its gradual withdrawal from the market as the decade approached its end marked the close of a particularly distinguished chapter in British car making, and those who owned one rarely forgot the experience. Number 4. The Morris Marina. The Morris Marina is a car whose reputation has suffered considerably at the hands of history, and not entirely without justification. Launched by British Leyland in 1971, it was designed with deliberate conservatism. The company needed a car that could be built quickly and cheaply, using as many existing components as possible. The result was a vehicle that felt distinctly old-fashioned almost from the moment it arrived in showrooms. Steering that derived from the ancient Marina, a chassis that prioritized production economics over dynamic quality, and build standards that varied enormously from one example to the next. And yet the Marina sold in very large numbers throughout the 1970s, because it was there, it was affordable, and it broadly did what was required of it. Its significance lies less in what it achieved than in what it represented, an industry making compromises it could not afford to make. Number 3. The Triumph Toledo. The Triumph Toledo arrived in 1970 as British Leyland's attempt to offer a little badge prestige at an accessible price point. For buyers who could not quite stretch to a Dolomite but wanted something that felt a step above the ordinary, the Toledo filled a genuine gap in the market. Its rear-wheel drive layout gave it handling characteristics that front-wheel drive rivals could not match, and the Triumph name still carried considerable weight with the British public at the time. However, the Toledo suffered from the same systemic problems that afflicted virtually everything emerging from British Leyland during this period: inconsistent build quality, inadequate investment in development, and an industrial relations climate that made reliable production almost impossible to sustain. It sold in reasonable numbers but never truly fulfilled its potential, quietly disappearing as the decade drew toward its close. Number 2. The British Leyland Mini. By the time the 1970s arrived, the Mini was already more than a decade old, and yet its presence on British roads was more dominant than ever. Alec Issigonis had created something genuinely transformative when he designed the original car in the late 1950s, and that fundamental rightness of concept refused to age in any meaningful way. Throughout the 1970s, the Mini continued to sell to an enormously diverse cross-section of British society: young drivers, urban commuters, fashion-conscious buyers who remembered its 1960s cultural associations. Its problems were real: rust, outdated production methods, and a price that crept upward without always reflecting improvements in the product. But the Mini's hold on the British imagination was something beyond rational analysis. It was, and remains, a piece of national identity pressed into sheet steel. Number 1. Austin and Morris 1100. And so we arrive at number 1, the car that, more than any other, defined the 1970s. British Road. The Ford Cortina, across its various generations, was the best-selling car in Britain for much of the decade, and its dominance was not accidental. Ford had studied the British buyer with extraordinary care and produced a car that answered almost every requirement simultaneously. It was spacious, reliable, economical, and available in a range of specifications that stretched from the functional to the genuinely comfortable. Fleet operators loved it. Families relied upon it. Sales representatives considered it their natural habitat. The Cortina appeared on every street, in every car park, outside every school and hospital and factory gate across the country. It carried no particular pretensions and made no extraordinary promises. It simply delivered, consistently and honestly, what British drivers actually needed. For that reason above all others, it stands at the summit of this list. Looking across this list as a whole, a clear pattern begins to emerge. The 1970s was a decade in which the British motor industry found itself pulled in fundamentally contradictory directions. On one side, genuine engineering talent and creative ambition continued to produce cars of real quality and innovation. On the other, chronic industrial disputes, underinvestment, management failures, and the rapidly rising tide of competition from Europe and Japan created conditions in which even good ideas struggled to reach their potential. British Leyland, which controlled so much of the domestic industry, became emblematic of these contradictions, capable of brilliance and mired in dysfunction in almost equal measure. Ford and Vauxhall, as American-owned operations, enjoyed structural advantages that their British-owned counterparts could rarely match. The cars on this list did not emerge from a vacuum. They emerged from a nation navigating enormous economic and industrial pressures, doing its best with what it had. The 1970s were a complicated, sometimes painful, always fascinating chapter in the story of British motoring, and the cars of that era carry all of those contradictions within them. Whether you remember these vehicles with deep affection or complicated feelings, they are an indelible part of who we were. If this journey through Britain's automotive past has meant something to you, please do like the video, leave a comment below, and subscribe to Britain Rewind. There is much more of Britain's story still to tell.